Well, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone joining us on this webinar for our fireside chat on AI security. So we've called this the Arius Risk Match webinar, and Match stands for Machine Learning, Artificial Intelligence, Threat Modeling, Compliance, and the H for how the heck all of these things link together. So I'm your host and moderator for the discussion today, Stephen de Vries, co-founder and CEO of Arius Risk. And I'm joined by a number of luminaries in the field of AI and ML security. Firstly, Dr. Gary McGraw, author of 12 books on security, and who also essentially helped define the field of software security. Got one of your books right here, Gary, which is one of them that inspired me to get into software security.
Some Chinese edition right up
there. I don't have the Chinese edition though. Very welcome, Gary. And the reason you're on is also because you're the founder of the Berryville Institute of Machine Learning, where the focus is on building threat models for AI systems. And I believe it was probably the first threat model that was published on AI and ML, right?
January 2020, I believe it was the first, yes.
There we go. Excellent. Welcome. I'm also joined by Neil Serebryany, founder and CEO of Calypso AI. And Calypso AI builds a system that helps you interact with AI and ML systems securely so that sensitive data isn't sent to untrusted AI and ML systems. And when you get that response back, that response is sanitized and secure, and you can use it internally. Welcome, Neil.
Thanks so much for having me.
And finally, and last but not least, is Siebe de Roovere from Torion in Belgium. And Siebe is a senior information security privacy consultant at Torion with a focus on data privacy and information security systems management. And Siebe is bringing this regulatory aspect to the conversation. Welcome, Siebe.
Good to be here, Stephen.
Great. I think, let's get started and get into the meat of this. We've got a lot to get through. And I think the first thing let me first just do some housekeeping here. We'd love for this to be interaction. We've got a few hundred people logged into this. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A functionality within Zoom. There's no chat, but there's a Q&A, so you can ask us questions, and the panelists will answer your questions there. The other thing to set the scene here is, what are we talking about when we're talking about AI security? We are not talking about using AI for security purposes, for building secure software or for using it in operations. What we are talking about is the security of AI, right? What are the security implications of using AI? How do we use it securely? And how do we make sure that we stay ahead here? The three key points that I'd like you to take away from this webinar are, firstly, that threat modeling and machine learning is leadership. It means that you are ahead of the pack. If you are analyzing your systems from a design perspective before you go and use AI and deploy AI systems, you are ahead of the pack, and you can essentially get that business benefit while reducing your security risk. The second point is that ML regulation is here, and Siebe and Neil will give us some perspective on that. If ChatGPT set the records for the number of users that they signed up in a record amount of time, I think the regulators that jumped on AI set another record for how quickly they responded to AI. And we'll get into more details during the discussion. And the third thing is that machine learning risk is novel, right? It's a new type of risk. There are new things that we need to care about. And it's not often that things change in the technology world where you've got a whole new class of security issues that you need to care about. This is one of those times, and we'll get into that as well. Let's kick off by starting with some interaction here, and I'd love to hear from our attendees on the webinar. Are you currently building or using AI systems? So I'm going to start a poll and feel free to answer that poll. We'll post the results as we continue the discussion, but we really want to get a sense, and you'll get a sense as well from everybody here, where are you in terms of your organizations rolling out AI? And if we can pick up, go ahead, Gary.
I'm sad that we don't get to vote.
Yeah, no, you don't get to vote, Gary. you get to have an opinion about the results of the vote. So I wanted to maybe kick off with you, Gary, on this concept that ML risk is novel, right? It's a new, there's new stuff we need to care about. Can you maybe expand on that? Like, why is this different?
Absolutely. Probably the number one critical difference is in machine learning. The whole idea is for the machine to be trained up on some training data, to become the data. And so there are a number of risks associated with that alone. For example, where did those data come from? Are they biased? Do they have confidential information stored in them? What if a bad person can attack them and change them or poison them? What if we produce bad information and we feed it back into the machine? All of these risks are somewhat related to things that we've been thinking about in security for many years, but they're also novel in a sense that the machine in machine learning becomes the data. I want everybody to think about when to use machine learning. And the number one message there is, if you know how to do something specifically, you should write a program to do that. If you don't know exactly how to carry something out, but you know what it is you want to have carried out, like tell me the difference between dogs and wolves, without describing everything in gory detail that would require a program, then we can use machine learning to do that sort of thing. So when we use machine learning to do something we don't know exactly how to do, by learning to be the data, we bring along a number of really interesting risks.
And what are some of those risks? If you look at the work that you've done at Berryville, and that you've also published, just for everybody on the call, the Berryville Institute has published an open source Creative Commons licensed threat model for AI and ML systems. Are there any risks in that threat model, Gary, that kind of stand out to you as the highest impact things that folks are maybe unaware of if they're coming from a traditional software security background?
There are, I think I'd like to identify the top 10 risks in large language models, if that's okay with you, Stephen.
Absolutely.
So this is something that we have been talking about in some talks, but we haven't published yet from BIML. And I'll just go over them briefly. The number one risk for large language models is what we call recursive pollution. And that's when you have a machine learning model that creates something incorrect or wrong, and it puts it out there on the internet or into your data pile. And then later it eats the same thing that it created, making a feedback loop of wrongness. That's called recursive pollution. And by my estimation, that's the number one risk in large language models today. Number two with large language models is involved with data trustworthiness and curation. Where do data come from to build these large language models? And I want to explain something that people have a hard time grasping often. Large means really large. Big data is so big that the human mind has a hard time comprehending that much bigness. So for example, ChatGPT has 14 trillion data points, not billion, not million, not hundreds, not thousands, but trillions, 14 trillion. That number is so large that there's only a couple of places you can go to get that amount of data. Out on the internet, scraping everything you can find and trying to give it a real quick cleanse before you eat it is how it's been done to build the foundation models of today. That means there's some stuff in there that it's just basically too big to check or even understand. And the data sets are often not really disclosed for some of these foundation models. So that's another example of a machine learning specific risk. Third one is transfer learning. Often when you're building an LLM, you start with a foundation model like ChatGPT or Google Bard, and everything that the foundation model has with regard to risks built in you drag along with you when you build an application. Number 4, nobody's really sure how these things work. So there's a lot of black box opacity involved. You can think of using an LLM foundation model as using an undocumented, unstable API that has arbitrary behavior. And we've built it to be that way on purpose because the stochastic nature of machine learning is what gives it incredible power and capability to generalize and capability to do things with less brittleness than symbolic AI, say. So we get that kind of stochastic behavior. And what that means is sometimes large language models can just be completely wrong. Number 5 is one that I'm sure everybody's played with in this group watching this webinar, prompt manipulation. You can have malicious input and it causes all sorts of hilarious, unstable behavior with large language models. My favorite thing to do is to tell ChatGPT to pretend to be Bard and then get it to do something that it's not allowed to do when it's ChatGPT, but it's happy to do when it's pretending to be Bard. So that's an example of prompt manipulation. So those are 5 risks, Stephen, and I think that's enough time talking about some of these risks.
That's excellent. Thanks, Gary. And that's some interesting new risks that we don't have, and we've never seen that before in software security. This isn't SQL injection. This isn't data validation. Well, one of them is kind of data validation, but at just at massive scale.
Yeah, isn't that funny? So malicious input turns out to be a problem in machine learning, just as it's a problem in every other kind of system we've ever built.
Yeah. Before we get to the polls, and while we're talking about some of the security risks with AI, Neil, you founded Calypso AI 2019. Before the big boom in ChatGPT. What were the main problems or security problems with AI that you were focused on, and the reason for founding Calypso?
Yeah, of course. And let me answer that with a bit of context. We've had a couple of kind of epochs in machine learning, going back to kind of Geoffrey Hinton's work creating deep neural networks in 2012 and 2013, where we had a set of risks post the kind of creation of deep neural networks around that time. But we also had this challenge where it was very, very difficult to build machine learning models. And so you had all of these open source libraries like PyTorch, TensorFlow, Keras that were developed in the context of building bespoke machine learning models. And so many of the risks that you had kind of prior to, the transformer architecture kind of becoming the dominant architecture within machine learning over the past year were really what I would describe as robustness-oriented risks. So your ability to be able to poison a machine learning model rested on the fact that you could introduce noise, for example, Gaussian noise, into the model that the model had previously not encountered or had not been aware of. And so what we were tracking, and what we really noticed were a couple of primary threats. One, you had certain threat actors at the high end, at the nation state level, that were experimenting with breaking or messing with machine learning models. In many cases, this was on the computer vision side of the house. And there was this really, really interesting kind of result for about a 3-year period where all of the computer science or all of the computer vision risks were about 12 months ahead of anything you saw on the cybersecurity side of the house. And so all of your most advanced threat actors would take new attacks from your computer vision literature and translate it into cybersecurity-oriented attacks. And then over the past year, with the transformer architecture, we've started to see the nature of risk kind of change, where you might be able to shift left as part of securing yourself in a bespoke model context. And in the context of using a foundation model, that's not possible to do because your underlying model is intrinsically vulnerable due to the fact that it's been trained on trillions upon trillions of data points and many, many billions of parameters. And so the inspiration for us was this kind of growing realization that for high criticality use cases, you would need to have some way of securing your systems. And now with what's happening in the context of transformer architectures and LLMs, it's really this realization that you're managing and working with many, many models. You're going to need some way of standardizing the risks that you're concerned about, and some way of interfacing or interacting with the underlying base model in a way that takes into account the risks associated with prompt injection attacks, and the risks associated with data leakage and PII and multi-model management.
Very interesting. And as you're describing this, it strikes me, if I said that Calypso AI is like a old style network firewall, but for AI, would I be off the mark?
I don't like to use firewall analogies here. Yeah. As a general rule of thumb, if you want to think about it as like, a SASE for machine learning, I think that could be an analogy you could kind of shoehorn here.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm showing my age here by using an old paradigm. Awesome. Thanks, Neil. Great. And we've also shared our poll here, the poll results. So we've got 43% yes, you are currently building or using AI systems, 32% trying it out, and 25% no. Anybody surprised by that? No? In line, right? There's pretty much what I think certainly what I was expecting is, I was actually expecting trying out was probably number one, then yes, and then no.
I think there's one thing worth mentioning, Stephen, here, which is that there's an awful lot of use of machine learning and large language models in particular in organizations that think that they're not allowed. And it's very surprising when you poke around and you find out what's actually happening if you, say, are a global multinational bank. And there's more machine learning being used today than a lot of people realize, even in their own organizations. You can call it shadow machine learning, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's
see and hear in a lot of industries is that a lot of companies are very eager to start with AI, but a lot of companies don't know the specific business or use case within their company yet. So I think this is also, seen in the results of this poll. I think a lot of companies are trying to do something with AI because everybody sees the potential, but don't know how to reap the potential for their own gain yet.
Yeah, and I think, to Gary's point, there's probably a lot of people that are just trying out, let me see what I can use ChatGPT for, without an officially sanctioned, we are doing a project on AI. It's just, experimentation at this stage. I think, let's pivot towards the regulation, because I think this is a fascinating area, super fast moving. And let's start off with a poll just to understand what our audience knows about AI security, regulation, and legislation. So I can see the polls coming up now. The results, we'll share them in a second. But maybe we can switch to that. So when when we are thinking about regulation and new changes, what are the two big areas that we need to look at? I think EU and US. What is going on in those two regulatory areas?
Yes, definitely. I think the EU is going the fastest because the old continent has really a very big legislative boom when it comes to cybersecurity at the moment. It goes a lot broader than artificial intelligence, because there are two, I would say, macroeconomic and societal reasons why the EU wants to build cyber laws. First of all, they want to build economic resilience within the industry, within the economy, in order to make us as a, I would say, group of nations more resilient against potential cyber warfare. But what EU also wants to do more than maybe other, I would say, regions in the world, is to protect citizens' rights when it comes to, I would say, threats from technology. The GDPR was the first example of this, which goes quite a lot broader than, for instance, the privacy legislation within the United States, with exception for some, I would say, sector-specific legislation such as HIPAA, for instance. So I think we are trying to take a more ethical stance within the EU when it comes to, I would say, technology legislation. There currently is built an AI Act within the EU, and there's also quite a lot of parallels between the AI Act and the GDPR, for instance, because they both are talking about security by design. They are demanding that AI is built in a secure way, but because legislation can never follow the technology, the words remain somewhat vague, and they state that security should be taken into the design, and often threat modeling is put forward as the best approach in order to implement this. This was the case within the GDPR, so data protection authorities are making threat modeling mandatory. And this is also added within the, I would say, annotations, the recommendations on how to implement the AI Act. Within the United States of America, we currently don't have any version of the AI Act, but a lot of very big technology companies were going to Congress with the question in order to create an American version of the AI Act as well. But then a lot of these very big technology companies also came with their own version of how this law should be implemented within the United States. So I think that the reasoning of implementing this law within the United States might be a bit more, I would say, created with the point of view of creating a competitive advantage versus an ethical protection of the citizens of the economic area for which the law would be applied to.
And in the US, it's also called the AI Act that the Biden administration has put in place. What are the key differences there versus what is happening in the EU?
The big difference is that there is a legislative text which is voted upon within the European Union. So in the European Union, you have actual, I would say, clauses that you can read, that you can try to comply with, and you can try to follow within your company. In the US, they are still in a phase before that. They have discussions within Congress, and the Congress is being heavily influenced by the big players, by the Googles, etc., from this world. But there is no legislative text yet which can be followed by the companies who try to implement AI in a compliant way. So if you are company that tries to implement AI and you're I would say a multinational which is present at multi continents, then I would say that a good way to start is looking at the European AI Act and start implementing, I would say, the legislative clauses, but in a way which is useful for your company. And I think privacy and security by design is always a good practice to enable, just to have a good end result, to have a good product, which is secure.
Yeah.
So that kind of goes to our first point, Stephen. If you do threat modeling of machine learning and you do things right from a design for security perspective, you're going to be leading and get ahead of the regulation, especially in the United States.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the regulation, as Siebe said, is quite they kind of just set the strategy. You should do security by design. You should do threat modeling of AI systems, but they don't say how. And that's certainly one of the things that we're focused on at Arius Risk is, well, how do I do that, right? What are the things I really need to care about? And we released our first AI library as part of the Arius Risk system, which you can try it on our free community edition, but it really lets you build a threat model using AI concepts and understand, well, what are the risks that I face here with the system that we're going to build. And I think an interesting or an important aspect of doing threat modeling is, when we do it for normal software security, we always say you're going to get benefits by doing it early on because you can avoid these problems later on down the rest of the development process. but that's doubly important for AI and ML systems, because if you get it wrong at design, it costs you a lot of money to retrain those models with new data sets that have been properly sanitized, and then go and rebuild the model at the other end of it, which is quite different from regular software security. On the regulatory aspect, I think it's quite telling that the EU, in the same sentence, said, you know, we want to be the leaders in AI. Step one, let's regulate it. Is regulation, is it better to be regulated or better to be unregulated in this space?
It really depends on what your desired outcome is. I think regulation is good to have an ethical outcome and to make sure that rights of individuals and consumers are taken into account. But from a competitive point of view, I think, yeah, the Americans are going to kick our asses again. As a wise man said before, it slows the innovation process a bit down, but yeah, it really depends on your desired outcome, I believe.
So here's the problem in the United States. It's not that we shouldn't have privacy protection. That would be great. And I think most Americans falsely believe they have some privacy protections. The problem is that Congress is made up of people who don't even believe in evolution. And so those kind of people are going to want to regulate artificial intelligence, and they don't even believe in science. It's a little bit difficult in a democracy that large, with points of view that may or may not be rational, to do the right thing regulatory wise. So I'm hoping that European rationalists will lead the way regulation wise. In the meantime, of course, it's the Wild West in California. So the Wild West is going to build lots of cool stuff, and we're all going to use it.
Super. Thanks for that view. And I think we got a question coming in on this legislation aspect, but in other geographies. Anyone on the panel, are you guys aware of what is happening outside of the EU and the US for AI legislation?
I don't know that much about the other areas, but I know there is a very cool website. It's called www.safe.ai, and it talks about the biggest societal risks about AI. And at number 2, it says the AI race between big geographical states and blocks. And I think that the big race, which is busy on a geographical, I would say, political level, is the race between China on one side and the United States on the other side. And if the United States is building very cool stuff, I don't think the Chinese will focus too much on, I would say, ethical laws that will prevent them to gain the same speeds. So I believe, based on, I would say, some assumptions, that the same rules apply more or less in that area of the world. But these are assumptions. We don't really have that much, I would say, customers in that part of the world, so I don't really know for sure, as I know for EU and US. Maybe Neil or Gary, you can add something about that area if you've anything to add.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So one, holistically, we should start with the fact that according to the letter of existing laws, no one is actually compliant with already existing regulations. So Article 17 and Article 19 of the General Data Privacy Act talks about the right to be forgotten. In the paradigm of a large language model, it's not actually possible to forget someone where your data has been trained on their data. So we should probably start with the primitive of the fact that no one is compliant, but for various reasons, that's it being ignored by regulators for the purposes of making technological progress. Then when we want to go ahead, the US is taking a different approach to regulation than the EU. The US is doing it on the basis of executive orders. So these are administrative policies that are set by the White House rather than by going through the drafting process. So we're actually seeing more, regulation is the wrong word, but more maybe standards put in place in the US than we are in the EU right now, in the form of the latest executive order on trustworthy development of AI. where every foundation model company over a certain parameter size was made to comply with the Defense Production Act. And the Defense Production Act is basically a set of rules that govern what companies can and can't do. And in particular, there was a set of rules that govern above a certain parameter size, how those models could be used and where the DoD and the White House had to be notified or not notified. The interesting meta point there is it's very, very similar to how the US actually tried to regulate encryption in the early to mid 90s as well. And if anyone remembers books of code as a way of trying to get around export controls and ITAR in the US, you can, from an analogous perspective, perhaps start to see similar things. Now, kind of moving on from there to, let's do China and Australia, maybe the UK as well, from a regulatory perspective. Unfortunately, I'm less familiar with Korean, or South Korean, just to be precise, regulation in the space, so I won't be able to comment on that. So let's go Australia and let's do a comparison of Australia versus the EU, just as a quick example here. Australia has one very, very big philosophical difference between what we're seeing in the EU and what we're seeing in the US. In the EU, as well as in the US, a lot of the standards and a lot of your compliance is process-driven. So for example, the importance of AI red teaming, or the importance of AI security, but it's not outcome or outputs oriented, where the philosophy that the Australian regulators have is very much outputs oriented. So we don't care what happens in between your training data and your underlying model, but we want to philosophically regulate certain outputs that are coming from the model and not coming from the model. And then on the China side of the house, I would encourage everyone to look at translated versions of China's 21 AI kind of Privacy Act. You can Google translate it if there aren't translated versions available, but CSET at Georgetown University maintains translated versions of these acts, as well as the 23 regulation. The really interesting thing is they've essentially co-opted the same exact verbiage that the US and the EU are using around trustworthy and ethical AI. And so if you actually look at the executive order in the US or some of the writing about the EU AI Act, they're very, very similar, except there is a penalty, both a significant financial penalty, as well as for certain defense-oriented outcomes, potentially a criminal penalty for not complying with China's acts. And where you're really getting down into is, what does it actually mean to be ethical? What does it actually mean to be trustworthy? And that's where you really get into the sociocultural differences and divergences between what you're going to see in China and what you're going to see in the US or in Europe.
And with
Correct.
these...
Excuse me, Stephen, if I may add one last thing about this topic. Within the GDPR, we also had an adequacy decision for data transfer between the EU and other countries, which means that the EU has said that a list of countries, such as Australia, for instance, were seen as trustworthy entities to which we, as a European company, for instance, could share our data with. And for instance, the United States, North China was on that list, which meant that American and Chinese companies needed to do additional things in order to make sure that they complied with the GDPR and made it visible towards European companies. The same principle might also apply to artificial intelligence and probably will be applied within the EU within the future, in which American, Australian, Korean, Chinese AIs must demonstrate that they have applied principles such as secure coding, etc., within their AI model before the AI model can be put on the market within the European Union. Of course, at this stage, we have been, the speed of execution was too high for the legislative framework. So things such as ChatGPT have already been widely accepted, but the legislative framework might still catch up to the technology and impose proof of compliance and ethical behavior also within other nation states if they want to do business within the EU. So I think that's a principle that might be applied within the future.
And are we, so the legislative aspect is one thing. And what we've seen is it's coming out at quite a high level, do secure things, don't harm the population, those kinds of, broad strokes. Is there anything in the pipeline within the standards body that's going to be a lot more detailed about exactly how are you meant to do that? Is the NIST, for example, working on anything in this area?
Yes, we've been contributing to the NIST risk management framework since late 2019 at this point. And if you actually look at a lot of the executive order in the US, it references NIST as the standard setting body that's actually going to create policies, and then your various regulatory agencies or your various industry specific agencies are then going to take those set of standards that come from NIST and customize them for their specific industry or the specific kind of vertical. And so at least historically, that's been the way that policy at the executive level has been created in the US. So if you look at the latest version of the NIST RMF framework, they have a new working group that we're part of focused on generative AI. And that working group focused on generative AI is actually creating more specific policies. And then you're going to see those policies interpreted. For example, the Fed is working on interpretations in the context of model risk management and their MRM policies for generative AI, taking into account the NIST framework and the overall White House executive order.
So I want to throw in a couple of cents here. One of the challenges with the current approach coming out of NIST and MITRE and also the executive branch is, in my view, an over-focus on red teaming. It reminds me of what we used to do in the very early days of software security and application security. Stephen, you're well familiar with this because you did this as services company 25 years ago, and that is lots of penetration testing. There's nothing wrong with penetration testing, but in my view, we can't penetration test or red team our way out of this. And thinking of AI control as adversarial artificial intelligence is not the right philosophy. Instead, we need to think about design for security and move well left of this red teaming approach. So while I agree with Neil that we are making some good real progress at NIST and with executive orders, I disagree that the philosophical approach is the right approach right now.
And there's an interesting comment from Scott McDonough in the question section here, where he says, I would think it would be difficult to set the standards, such as by NIST, before the technology is understood, let alone developed to a certain level of maturity. Do we understand the technology well enough in order to start putting in detailed standards at this stage, or do we still need to discover more before we start describing what good looks like from a security perspective?
Well, have we stopped developing brand new technology that's blowing our minds yet? Nope.
Good. Right. Let's switch to another poll. Gary, one of the things you mentioned earlier was this divide between the number of the risks that are faced by ML systems, some applying to the data and some applying to the machine learning technology. So I'm launching a poll here for the audience participants. If you want to answer the question of which do you think, or how do you think those two sets of risks play out in practice? Because I think that's an interesting discussion point. And while you as participants are answering this, what do the panelists think? How do you think the split is between the data risks versus the tech risks?
I can start if you want. I have an opinion here based on the 78 risks that we identified and published in January 2020 with regard to generic machine learning models. Now, this kind of goes back to your point just a second ago. 2020 was forever ago in machine learning. And we've had a huge uptake of large language models and more particular foundation models that's changed everything in machine learning. That doesn't mean that the old stuff doesn't apply, but what that does mean is that we're being swamped by a set of new technology. However, in the work for the BIML 78, we identified 78 risks. About 60% of those were related directly to data. 40% were more normal risks that you'd think that apply to standard tech risks. Now, we've just done the same exercise for large language models, which we haven't published yet. And I'm busy writing that up. In fact, I have an open document over there that I'm supposed to be working on instead of participating in webinars. But I don't have a number for you. But I will say this: as long as we realize that some risks are really new and they're data related and not data protection related or the usual data stuff that we remember from information security, but new kinds of data when the data becomes dynamic, when it starts doing stuff, those are the risks that are the most interesting. And I think everybody agrees that they're there.
Yeah. And certainly from the poll, we got the most answers were for the 60% data, 40% tech. Well done, attendees. You've either read the BIML or you have a deep understanding of the risks to AI. Congratulations. Right. I think one of the things that obviously we're very interested at Arius Risk on using threat modeling as a way to identify the risks for AI. What do you think the opportunity is for threat modeling for ML, Gary, and maybe Siebe?
I will pick into that question later, but I was still wondering about the previous question. I'm sorry for that. Personally, I believe that the type of the tech will vary over time. And now we're currently very focusing a lot on data protection, because a lot of the biggest risks are related to data. But I believe that companies can have a better grip on the data than on the technology aspects quite often within artificial intelligence, because a lot of use cases of artificial intelligence within companies are actually, I would say, smaller pieces of data compared to, for instance, the ChatGPT library. They use their own library specifically based upon their own processes, their own customer data, for instance. And that is something for which data protection and the protection of the integrity of the data can be managed a lot more easier, I believe, than the data of the entirety of the internet. So if you're able to protect your company's data quite well, then it's the technological layer that becomes more vulnerable. So I think that within the future, for company purposes, and then I'm not talking about the Googles, but I would say that the more average company, the technology layer will be the more vulnerable layer that should be protected. And of course, threat modeling, I would say technology is something that we know better or do more often than threat modeling data, because the threat modeling methodology, Stride, etc., was specifically built to understand architectures, to understand algorithms, and to find the loopholes within technology.
Okay, but Stride was built by an operating system vendor, so that was not the only way to threat model. It's just a list of specific threats. And I know that Adam's listening, so hi, Adam. I do want to point out a kind of an interesting phenomenon that I've been noticing. I'd like to call it data feudalism, maybe. So the notion that we could go out and scrape everything and build a foundation model out of everything is really interesting. The problem is that large corporations have realized that their huge data sets are valuable. So they're building moats around these data sets. You can think about it as kind of geographically defining data sets. And whether they'll share them with each other is one thing, but certainly it's going to be much harder to build a large-scale foundation model in the future than it was only in 2 years ago, 2021, because getting a big enough pile of data is a hard thing to do. And data feudalism means the people that have the data, kind of like the people that have the land or the capital in early stage capitalism, are going to do all they can to defend those data. Now, we have a different view of data in the United States than you do in Europe, Siebe. You know, if you think about the notion that an individual owns their own data about themselves in Europe, we don't share that view in the United States, unfortunately. And so this notion of sucking up all the data and then protecting it in a data moat is going to have a gigantic, enormous impact on machine learning going forward. And it actually strangely leads towards more authoritarian governments having more data and maybe building more interesting or terrible, as the case may be, machine learning approaches. I'm thinking of China in particular. And so, you know, it's interesting times with regard to what we should be paying attention to. But I think that the notion of data feudalism is one we've got to start talking about.
Interesting. Thanks for that perspective, Gary. And I think we're coming up to the 10 minutes left in the webinar. This is a very fast moving area, right? And I think if we drew a line from where we were, pre ChatGPT to where we are now, and we look ahead, what do we all think the future looks like for AI and AI security?
So why don't I take this one first, and then we go from there. I think it's pretty simple. Number one, the use cases for LLMs are really going to start to be more and more explored in the enterprise next year. Chat as a new way to interface with data is cool, but that's not ultimately where the greatest enterprise value will be unlocked. I'll give you one simple example of an unlock we're going to start to see next year that's going to change the enterprise. It's going to actually be in the automated data labeling space. So data labeling is the bane of existence of pretty much every enterprise that wants to work with data. And you can actually have LLMs with a fairly high degree of accuracy and with some amount of prompt engineering, classify or label your data for you. And we're going to see a larger and larger number of models, both internal RAG models, as well as fine-tuned models, as well as a large number of external models, both those provided by your foundation model providers, as well as those provided or integrated into SaaS applications, as well as open source models like Llama 2. And we're also going to see your different data sovereignty regimes, for example, in the EU, in the US, and in China, come to affect how you have to interact and use models in the context of a globally oriented enterprise. From a risk perspective, ultimately the challenge with LLMs is not a robustness-oriented challenge. They're intrinsically robust based on the size that these models are in terms of number of parameters. And so instead, you're going to have more and more need for security solutions that almost enable you to work with or enable you to interact with LLMs and enable security both at the prompt and the response level for LLMs you're interacting with, like our product, Calypso AI's moderator capability.
Thank you, Neil. Gary, Siebe?
This is really I would say, the $1 million question. What is AI going to mean for us in the future? And I think we're just at the very early stages of an interesting learning curve. I think we're talking about ChatGPT 3.5 and 4 at this stage, and a lot of people were really amazed by what it could do. But very soon we will be at ChatGPT 10.0, and it will be a lot more amazing, even a lot more amazing than it is today. So I really believe that artificial intelligence will solve quite a lot of problems. It will increase our understanding of the medical world, for instance, of the universe, of physics, and it will be used to solve a lot of the biggest problems that we as humans are facing with today. On the other side, artificial intelligence in the wrong hands can also be used to create totalitarian states, etc. So it is really hard to predict where this will all end and how fast it will go. I think a lot of people in the past year, especially the people who weren't really focusing on AI, thought like, whoa, everything is going so fast right now. We will be totally redundant and our jobs will be totally redundant within a couple of years. But I have heard quite a lot of very smart people say that there will be a new AI winter quite soon, because a lot of people will get over the hype, and then they will see how difficult it really is to implement an AI in a useful way within their context. So this is a quite vague answer to say that it really can go to a lot of different directions. And I really believe that we haven't seen quite a lot yet, and that we're at the early stages of this technology. And yeah, what a time to be alive. The tale of two cities.
Okay, I'll take the ball, Stephen. I am totally psyched about AI and machine learning. A lot of you may not know, but my first work in grad school was on artificial intelligence, and in particular, I did my PhD with Doug Hofstadter, who wrote Go to Lescherbach a million years ago, and wrote a pretty famous AI program myself back in the day. Now, it was not a machine learning model, but I did lots of machine learning 25 years ago. And I have to tell you that even though things are somewhat the same, the bigness of big data and the bigness of the compute power that we have to wield neural networks and deep neural networks to do what we're doing today is phenomenal. I feel like I felt in 1981 when I got an Apple II Plus and I started writing code. It was very exciting. There was so much to do, so much fun. I think it's a challenge for all of us to keep up with what's going on in machine learning and AI. And I think it's important that we focus some attention on the benefits that these technologies can bring to society and the cool things that we can build if we have interfaces where we can talk to machines instead of just typing at them or programming them in, for God's sake, C++. So I think that we're going to have some cool stuff happen. Now, as a security guy, I want to be careful about how we adopt that cool stuff and how we design the cool stuff and make sure that we can control it. So I'm pretty excited about both what you're building at Arius Risk in terms of threat modeling, machine learning applications, and also what you're building at Calypso in terms of controls for particular risks in a situation. And I think that that's the sort of area where in security, we're going to see a great deal of growth and change. And I'm super psyched that both of you two are talking to each other, Stephen and Neil, and we'll all make progress together as we adopt this exciting technology.
Excellent. Thanks, Gary. And I want to just add my 2 cents here, which is really based on one of your famous sayings, Gary, of the split between software security issues. 50% are bugs and 50% are architectural flaws. And in my opinion, as tools like GitHub's Copilot start becoming more and more popular, machines are going to be writing a lot more of the code for us. That means humans are going to be doing more of the architecture and machines are going to be doing more of the coding. And as machines do more of the coding and they get better at it, they make fewer mistakes than we do. And so in my view, the security of architecture and the security of design is going to become more and more important versus avoiding writing individual lines of bad code in your IDE. The machine is going to do that stuff for you. So I'm equally excited about what this new world looks like. And for all the participants, let's start with a final poll. And as Gary mentioned, we at Arius Risk provide an AI library. It helps you do threat modeling of your AI systems. Calypso provides protection of your data and also interacting with LLMs and ML systems. If you would like to see a demo of either our technology or of Calypso's, please respond in the quiz, and we'll reach out to you and find out which one you want to see, and we'll definitely be in touch with you. So let's wrap it up there. I want to say a big thank you to our participants, Siebe from Torion, Neil from Calypso AI, and Gary McGraw from the Berryville Institute of Machine Learning. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks for all the attendees for your participation and for listening in. Thanks all, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.